Hello, friend. Welcome back. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know. There's something special about sharing these stories across time zones, across continents, knowing that somewhere, someone else is settling in just like you, curious about the same ancient mysteries. Tonight, we're traveling to a place where the desert meets the river, where the sun doesn't just rise, it's reborn. We're going to Egypt, but not the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids you might expect. We're going deeper, to the very foundations of how the ancient Egyptians understood everything: creation itself, death, chaos, order, and the delicate balance between worlds. Picture this: the Nile Delta, around 3100 BCE. Though the stories we'll explore are far older than any written record. The air is thick with moisture from the river, and as the sun climbs, you can almost see the heat rising from the sand. Farmers are already in the fields, watching the water level, knowing their entire existence depends on the river's annual flood. But they're not just watching water, they're watching a god. The Nile isn't simply a river, it's the physical manifestation of divine will, the bloodstream of creation itself. Here's what makes Egyptian mythology different from almost every other belief system. It never had one creation story. It had several, sometimes contradictory, often running parallel to each other, depending on which city you were in, which temple held power, which priest was telling the tale. In Heliopolis, the sun created everything. In Memphis, thought and speech brought the world into being. In Hermopolis, there were 8 primordial deities churning in the waters of chaos before anything existed. And somehow, beautifully, maddeningly, all of these were true at once. The Egyptians didn't see contradiction the way we do. They saw layers, facets of a truth too vast for one telling. This is crucial to understand before we go any further. Egyptian mythology isn't a neat, linear story. It's a vast, interconnected web of narratives that evolved over 3,000 years. Longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Islam, longer than Buddhism. Imagine if we tried to create one coherent story from every Christian denomination, every interpretation, every local tradition from the time of Jesus to today. That's the challenge of Egyptian mythology. But there are threads we can follow, patterns that emerge. And the most fundamental pattern is this: the Egyptians were obsessed with order versus chaos, with Ma'at versus Isfet. Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, the way things should be. Isfet, chaos, disorder, the breakdown of all structure. Every god, every myth, every ritual was ultimately about maintaining Ma'at, about keeping the universe from sliding back into the primordial waters of chaos from which it emerged. Why does this matter? Why should you care about gods with animal heads and creation stories involving cosmic eggs and self-generating deities? Because these myths shaped one of the most successful civilizations in human history. For 3 millennia, while empires rose and fell around them, while languages died and cultures vanished, Egypt endured. And it endured in part because of these stories, because they gave meaning to the Nile's flood, purpose to the pharaoh's rule, hope in the face of death, and structure to a universe that could otherwise seem terrifyingly random. The questions Egyptian mythology answers are the same ones we still ask. Where did everything come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? What happens when we die? Why do good people suffer? How do we maintain order in a chaotic world? What is our purpose? The Egyptians' answers are strange to our ears. They involve crocodile gods and dung beetles rolling the sun across the sky. But the questions beneath them are achingly familiar. Tonight, we're going to trace the entire arc from the moment before creation through the birth of the gods, the establishment of divine order, the struggle against chaos, the rule of the gods on earth, their eventual retreat to the heavens, and finally, how these myths evolved, survived, and eventually faded, leaving behind treasures we're still excavating from the sand. We'll meet Atum, who created himself and then created everything else. We'll witness Ra's daily battle against the serpent of chaos. We'll watch Osiris be murdered, dismembered, and resurrected. We'll see Isis search the world for her husband's scattered body parts. We'll follow Horus as he fights his uncle Set for the throne of Egypt. We'll descend into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, where the dead face trials and transformations. And we'll explore how these ancient stories influenced everything from Greek philosophy to Jewish mysticism to modern pop culture. But we'll also pause, often, to remember the people who believed these stories. The mother whispering prayers to Taweret, goddess of childbirth, hoping her baby would survive. The scribe invoking Thoth before beginning his work. The pharaoh performing rituals to ensure the Nile would flood. The embalmers reciting spells from the Book of the Dead, genuinely believing they were helping the deceased navigate the afterlife. These weren't just stories, they were the operating system of an entire civilization. Now, let's begin. Let's go back to before the beginning, to the waters of Nun, where nothing existed except infinite potential. Before there was anything, there was none. The primordial waters, infinite and dark and completely undifferentiated. Not empty space because space didn't exist. Not silence because sound hadn't been invented, just potential, endless and formless. The Egyptians called this the non-existent, but it was more than nothing. It was the state before existence, pregnant with all possibilities. In Heliopolis, the cult center of the sun god, priests told it this way: from Nun arose a mound, a primordial hill breaking the surface of the waters. This moment, this first separation of something from nothing, was called the Benben. You can still see its echo in every Egyptian pyramid. That distinctive pyramidion at the peak is meant to represent this first mound, this first moment of creation, catching the first light of dawn. Think about that paradox for a moment. Atum existed before existence. He was complete before anything existed to be part of. He was alone in a way we can barely comprehend. Alone not just without others, but without space, time, or differentiation of any kind. What Atum did next is told several ways, and all of them are slightly uncomfortable for modern sensibilities, which is precisely why they're interesting. In the most common version, Atum masturbated, and from his emission came the first divine pair, Shu, god of air and light, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture and order. Sex and creation were inseparable in Egyptian thought, not crude, but fundamental. Creation was an act of desire, of will, of bodily reality. Other versions say Atum sneezed them out, or spat them forth, or spoke them into being. The Memphis theology, which we'll explore more later, preferred the idea that Atum, or Ptah in their version, thought them and then spoke them, and the speaking made them real. The heart thinks, the tongue commands, went their formula. This is remarkably sophisticated theology. Creation through logos, through divine word, an idea that would echo through Jewish and Christian thought millennia later. But let's stay with Shu and Tefnut for now, because their story illustrates something crucial about Egyptian mythology. Shu represented air, breath, the space between things. Tefnut represented moisture, the substance of life. Together, they were the first differentiation, the first separation of the unified into complementary opposites. And then they did what gods do. They made love, and from their union came Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Here's where it gets beautiful and strange. Geb and Nut fell so deeply in love that they embraced constantly, locked together, leaving no space between earth and sky for anything to exist. Their father Shu had to physically separate them, standing between his children, pushing Nut up to create the vault of heaven, while Geb sprawled below as the land. You can see this in Egyptian art. Nut arched overhead, her body studded with stars, while Geb lies beneath, and Shu stands between them, arms raised, forever holding up the sky. Imagine how this myth would resonate with someone living along the Nile. Every morning, they'd see the sun emerge from Nut's body in the east. She was literally swallowing the sun each evening and birthing it each dawn. The earth beneath their feet was the body of Geb. The air they breathed was Shu. The dew on the morning grass was Tefnut's tears. The divine wasn't separate from the physical world, it was the physical world understood correctly. But Geb and Nut's separation wasn't complete. Before Shu separated them, Nut had become pregnant. Not once, but 5 times, Ra, the sun god who would become paramount in Egyptian theology, discovered this and became furious. Perhaps he saw the threat these new gods posed to cosmic order. He declared that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. This is where Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, enters our story. Thoth gambled with the moon and won from her 1/72nd of her light, enough to create 5 new days outside the normal calendar. These were the epagomenal days, neither part of the old year nor the new, existing in a liminal space between time. On these 5 days, Nut gave birth to the 5 gods who would shape the central drama of Egyptian mythology: Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and sometimes Horus the Elder. These 5 children of Geb and Nut were different from the gods who came before. The earlier gods were cosmic forces: air, moisture, earth, sky. But these 5 were more personal, more involved in the realm of human experience. Osiris would become the god of death and resurrection, the first pharaoh, the lord of the underworld. Isis would be the great magician, the devoted wife, the archetype of feminine power and protection. Set would be chaos personified, the god of storms and deserts and foreign lands, necessary but dangerous. Nephthys would be the lady of the temple, Set's wife but Osiris's lover. And Horus would be kingship itself. Already in these foundation myths, we can see the themes that would obsess Egyptian religion for millennia: creation from nothing, separation and reunion, the establishment of order, the tension between unity and multiplicity, the interweaving of cosmic and earthly realms. The Ennead, as these 9 gods were called, Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, and the 5 siblings, formed the core pantheon of Heliopolis. But remember, this was just one telling, one city's version. In Memphis they told it differently, with Ptah as the supreme creator. In Hermopolis, 8 primordial deities preceded everything. In Thebes, Amun would eventually eclipse them all. What matters isn't which version was true, that's not how the Egyptians thought. What matters is understanding that from the very beginning, Egyptian mythology was about explaining the world they experienced. Why the sun rose, why the Nile flooded, why there was land and sky, why humans existed, why there was order rather than chaos, and ultimately, why death didn't have to be the end. These foundation myths established the template. Now we need to see how these gods interacted, how they governed, how they created the structure of Egyptian civilization, both divine and human. Because the next chapter in our story moves from cosmic creation to earthly rule, from the realm of pure mythology to the borderland where myth and history blur together. The gods, having been born, now faced a question. How should the world be governed? This wasn't an abstract philosophical problem for the Egyptians. The divine realm and the earthly realm were mirror images, interpenetrating realities. How the gods organized themselves would determine how humans should organize themselves. The pharaoh wasn't just like a god, he was a god, or at least became one through ritual and coronation. Osiris was the firstborn of Geb and Nut, and according to primogeniture, he inherited the earthly realm, specifically Egypt itself. This is where mythology and history begin their intricate dance. Was there ever actually a King Osiris who ruled Egypt before the dynasties we can verify? Almost certainly not. But the Egyptians believed there was, and they dated his reign to the time of the gods, before human pharaohs, when the gods themselves walked the Black Land and ruled from earthly thrones. Osiris, by all accounts, was an ideal king. He taught humans agriculture, how to plant wheat and barley, how to cultivate the grapevine, how to brew beer. He gave them laws and showed them how to worship the gods properly. He taught them music and the arts of civilization. Under his rule, Ma'at prevailed. There was order, abundance, justice, harmony. The Nile flooded on schedule. The harvest was plentiful. Death had not yet entered the world with its current finality. Beside Osiris stood Isis, his sister wife. Here we need to pause and address something that makes modern readers uncomfortable. The gods regularly married their siblings. But remember, these are primordial beings. In the beginning, who else was there to marry? The Egyptians saw this as necessary rather than aberrant. Gods operated under different rules than humans. Moreover, pharaohs would later marry their sisters specifically to emulate the gods, to maintain the divine bloodline's purity, to keep power within the family in a land where the throne was literally a gift from the gods. Isis was no mere consort. She was Osiris's equal in many ways, the great of magic, the throne itself personified. Her very name meant throne, and the hieroglyph depicting her was a seat. The pharaoh sat on Isis. He derived his legitimacy from her. She knew the secret names of the gods, the words of power that could compel even Ra himself. She was wisdom, protection, magic, devotion. The mother goddess who would eventually be worshipped from Egypt to Britain, from the Nile to the Rhine, her cult outlasting even the other Egyptian gods. The divine court wasn't just Osiris and Isis. Nephthys, sister to both, married Set. Thoth served as vizier and scribe, recording everything, mediating disputes, maintaining the cosmic order through words and numbers. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, already presided over burial rites, though the full significance of his role wouldn't become clear until death entered the world. Ma'at herself, both goddess and concept, was the standard by which everything was measured. But in every paradise, there's a serpent. In this case, it was Set. Set was the god of chaos, but not chaos as ultimate evil, not yet. He was the desert beyond the Nile's cultivation, the red land versus the black land. He was storms, foreigners, warfare, violence, the untamed and untamable. He was necessary. Someone had to fight Apophis, the serpent of ultimate chaos, during Ra's nightly journey. Someone had to embody the wild places beyond civilization. Set was the guard dog of creation, fierce and unpredictable, necessary but dangerous. But Set was also jealous. While Osiris ruled the fertile Nile Valley, Set received the barren deserts. While Osiris was beloved, Set was feared. While Osiris brought life and growth, Set brought sterility and death. The earliest versions of the myth don't explain Set's motivations beyond this jealousy, but later texts elaborate. Set wanted to rule, wanted the recognition, wanted the throne that went to his older brother simply by accident of birth order. The murder of Osiris is the pivotal moment in Egyptian mythology, the event that changes everything, that introduces death, that establishes the pattern of resurrection, that creates the need for the afterlife and the complex burial practices that would define Egyptian civilization. But before we get to that catastrophe, we need to understand what was being destroyed. Under Osiris, society organized itself around the principle of Ma'at. The pharaoh, god-king, stood at the apex, mediator between the divine and human realms. Beneath him, a hierarchy of priests, nobles, scribes, artisans, farmers, and servants, each with their role, each necessary, each part of the cosmic order. Property was owned, laws were recorded, disputes were settled, taxes were collected. This wasn't oppression, though it could be. It was order, structure, the opposite of chaos. The economy centered on agriculture, specifically the wheat and barley grown in the Nile's annual flooding. The flood itself was divine. Happy, the androgynous Nile god with a pregnant belly, brought the inundation each year. But humans had to cooperate with the divine gift through irrigation, planting, harvesting, storage. The pharaoh's granaries became redistributive centers. Surplus fed the non-farmers, the pyramid builders, the priests, the scribes, the artists who decorated tombs and temples. Religion permeated everything. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic centers, landowners, employers. Priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were the literate class, the keepers of knowledge, the astronomers who predicted the flood, the physicians who understood the body, the embalmers who prepared the dead. The line between sacred and secular didn't exist. Everything was sacred if done properly, in accordance with Ma'at. Daily life for commoners involved rituals we'd recognize: morning offerings to household gods, prayers before meals, protective amulets, festivals that marked the seasons. The gods weren't distant abstractions, but active participants in daily existence. Best protected children and women in childbirth. Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, also guarded mothers and infants. Khnum crafted each person on his potter's wheel. Renenutet blessed the harvest. Hathor brought joy and music and love. This was the world Osiris built, the civilization the gods established as a template for humans. It was order carved from chaos, meaning wrested from the void, life flourishing in a narrow ribbon of green surrounded by infinite desert. It was fragile, dependent on the Nile's annual miracle, maintained by constant ritual and work and attention to Ma'at, and it was about to be shattered by Set's jealousy, plunging the world into grief, dismemberment, and the invention of death as the Egyptians understood it, not as ending, but as transformation, journey, trial, and ultimately potential resurrection. The Golden Age under Osiris couldn't last forever, though the Egyptians wished it could. What happened next became the central myth of Egyptian religion, told and retold, painted on tomb walls, recited in funerary texts, enacted in temple rituals for 3,000 years. The murder of Osiris and what followed established the very foundations of Egyptian kingship, death ritual, and cosmic order. Set's plot was cunning. He couldn't simply challenge Osiris openly. His brother was beloved, legitimate, divinely ordained. So Set held a feast, a magnificent banquet, and commissioned a beautiful chest, decorated with precious materials, sized exactly to Osiris's measurements. During the celebration, Set offered this chest as a prize to whomever it fit perfectly. One by one, the guests tried to lie inside. None fit. Set had made sure of that. Finally, unsuspecting, Osiris lowered himself into the chest. It fit like it was made for him, which of course it was. Immediately, Set's co-conspirators, 72 accomplices, the texts say, slammed the lid shut, nailed it, sealed it with molten lead, and threw it into the Nile. Think about this image: the god who taught agriculture, who brought civilization, who represented order itself, locked in a coffin and cast into the waters. The river that brought life now carried death. The Nile, manifestation of divine beneficence, became a vehicle of murder. Everything Osiris built was suddenly, violently disrupted. The chest floated down the Nile, out through the delta, into the Mediterranean Sea, eventually washing up on the coast of Byblos, in modern Lebanon. There, a tamarisk tree grew around it, incorporating the chest into its trunk, and the tree grew so magnificent that the king of Byblos cut it down to use as a pillar in his palace. Inside the pillar, inside the tree, inside the chest, lay Osiris, dead, hidden, far from Egypt. Meanwhile, Isis had discovered the murder. The texts describe her anguish in visceral terms. She tore her robes, cut her hair, wandered Egypt wailing in grief. But Isis wasn't just grieving, she was searching. Using her magic, she divined that Osiris's body lay in Byblos, and she travelled there, disguised herself as a serving woman, gained entrance to the palace, and eventually revealed her true nature to the queen of Byblos. The queen, awed and terrified, gave Isis the pillar. Isis cut it open, retrieved the chest, and brought Osiris's body back to Egypt. She hid it in the marshes of the delta, in the papyrus thickets where Set wouldn't think to look, and then she left to gather herbs and prepare the rituals that might bring him back. But Set, hunting in those marshes by moonlight, stumbled upon the hidden body. His rage was absolute. He tore Osiris's corpse into 14 pieces. Some texts say 16, some say 42, and scattered them the length of Egypt, from the delta to the first cataract. An arm in one city, a leg in another, the phallus eaten by a fish, organs distributed like obscene seed across the Black Land. This dismemberment is crucial to understanding Egyptian theology. Osiris wasn't just killed, he was unmade, scattered, dissolved back toward the chaos from which creation emerged. His body, symbol of order and kingship and life, was fragmented, hidden, dispersed. It would require the greatest magic ever performed to restore him. Isis began her second search. Across Egypt she wandered, accompanied now by Nephthys, her sister, Set's wife, who had turned against her husband in horror at his crime. Wherever they found a piece of Osiris, they buried it, or in some versions left a marker, which is why so many cities claim to hold Osiris's tomb. Each piece became a sacred site, a pilgrimage destination, a place where the veil between life and death grew thin. When Isis had gathered all the pieces except the phallus, devoured by the Nile fish, which is why priests thereafter refused to eat certain fish species, she performed the first mummification. With Nephthys's help, and guided by Anubis, who became the patron of embalmers, Isis reassembled Osiris's body, wrapped it in linen, recited the spells, performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, and restored his breath. Not fully, not as he was, but enough. Enough for what? Enough for Isis to transform herself into a kite, a bird of prey, and hover over Osiris's restored but still dead body, fanning him with her wings, bringing divine breath into his lungs one last time. Enough for her to lower herself onto him and conceive a child, Horus, the Avenger, the heir, the future king. This is one of the most powerful images in Egyptian mythology. Isis, wings spread, hovering over her dead husband, bringing life from death, creating the future from the ruins of the past. Every tomb painting that shows a bird goddess protecting the dead echoes this moment. Every amulet of Isis with wings recalls this act of desperate magic and determined love. But Osiris couldn't return to the world of the living. The rituals Isis performed didn't resurrect him to earthly life. They transformed him into the first mummy, the first dead king, the ruler of the afterlife. He became Lord of the West, where the sun sets, judge of the dead, foremost of the Westerners. He would rule the Duat, the underworld, while Horus would inherit his earthly throne. This established the pattern every pharaoh would follow. In life, he was Horus incarnate. In death, he became Osiris. Kingship flowed from father to son, from Osiris to Horus, repeated in every generation. Death wasn't ending, it was transformation, continuation of rule in a different realm. Set, meanwhile, claimed the throne. He was the killer, the usurper, but he was also the only adult male god available. The texts are ambiguous about this period. Was Set a tyrant or simply the wrong king? Did he rule badly or just illegitimately? What's clear is that Ma'at was disrupted. The natural order had been violated. A wound had been opened in the cosmos that needed healing. That healing would come through Horus, but not immediately. Isis had to hide, had to raise her son in secret in the Delta marshes, had to protect him from Set's attempts on his life, had to prepare him for the confrontation to come. The infant Horus faced trials even in the womb, and as a child, scorpion stings, serpent bites, fevers, all the dangers that threatened Egyptian children, all the reasons mothers prayed to Isis for protection. These stories established Isis as the archetypal mother, fierce and protective, willing to do anything for her child. They also normalized the dangers of childhood, gave religious meaning to the tragically high infant mortality rate, offered hope that the gods understood a mother's grief because Isis herself had fought to keep Horus alive. When Horus reached adulthood, the real confrontation could begin. The battle between Horus and Set for the throne of Egypt became another central myth, told in various versions, sometimes as straightforward combat, sometimes as a legal battle before the Council of Gods, sometimes as a series of contests combining both violence and cunning. The conflict between Horus and Set for Egypt's throne wasn't a brief battle. It was an 80-year struggle that tested not just physical strength, but divine law itself. This prolonged contest became the template for how Egyptians understood legitimate authority, legal precedent, and the relationship between power and right. The Council of the Gods, led by Ra, now called Ra-Atum, or sometimes Ra-Horakti, showing how the sun god had absorbed other identities, convened to hear the case. On one side stood Horus, son of Osiris, legitimate heir by blood. On the other stood Set, powerful, dangerous, the god who protected Ra's solar bark during its nightly journey through the underworld. Both had claims. The debates reveal sophisticated political theology. Horus argued primogeniture and divine right. His father had been king, therefore he should be king. Set argued strength and capability. What good was a rightful heir if he couldn't protect Egypt from chaos? Some gods supported Horus's claim, others feared Set's power. Ra himself seemed ambivalent, possibly because he relied on Set to fight Apophis, the chaos serpent that tried to devour the sun each night. The contest that followed combined combat, trickery, legal maneuvering, and outright magic. In one famous episode, Set challenged Horus to a race in boats made of stone. Set built his boat of stone, and it sank. Horus built his boat of wood, painted to look like stone, and won. When Set discovered the deception, his rage was spectacular. Another contest involved transforming into hippopotamuses and diving into the Nile to see who could hold their breath longest. Isis, watching from shore, couldn't bear the thought of either combatant dying. She threw a harpoon into the water, but it struck Horus by mistake. She withdrew it, threw again, and struck Set. When Set surfaced, wounded, he reproached his sister for attacking him, her own brother. Isis, moved by his words, removed the harpoon, and Horus, furious at his mother's sympathy for his enemy, emerged from the water and cut off her head. This shocking detail, the beheading of Isis, needs context. Thoth, god of wisdom and magic, immediately restored Isis's head, but replaced it with a cow's head, which is why Isis is sometimes depicted with cow horns and a solar disk, or why she becomes conflated with Hathor, the cow goddess. The episode illustrates the emotional intensity of the conflict, how even the bonds between mother and son could fray under pressure. The most disturbing episode involves sexual violence and magic. Set attempted to rape Horus to humiliate him and prove dominance. But Horus caught Set's semen in his hand and threw it into the marshes. Then Horus obtained his own semen, and Isis spread it on lettuce, Set's favourite food. When Set ate the lettuce, he unknowingly ingested Horus's essence. Later, before the Council of Gods, Set claimed to have dominated Horus sexually. But when Thoth called forth the semen to prove it, Set's semen answered from the marshes, while Horus's semen answered from inside Set's body, emerging from Set's forehead as a golden disc, which Thoth took and wore as a crown. Modern readers often find these stories bizarre or offensive, but they're deeply meaningful within Egyptian culture. The contest demonstrated different kinds of power: physical, magical, sexual, verbal, legal. They showed that legitimate authority required not just birthright, but capability, not just strength, but cleverness, not just power, but divine endorsement verified by the gods themselves. Finally, after 80 years, the Council of Gods ruled in Horus's favour. But the resolution wasn't Set's destruction, it was his relegation to a specific role. Set would remain the god of storms and deserts and foreign lands, the one who fought chaos on behalf of order, but he would never rule Egypt. The throne belonged to Horus and his successors, the pharaohs, who were each the living Horus during their reign. This resolution established the divine kingship model that would govern Egypt for millennia. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, son of Ra, legitimate ruler blessed by the gods. His authority came from divine descent, Horus's bloodline through Osiris, divine function, maintaining Ma'at, and divine endorsement, coronation rituals that transformed him into a god. When he died, he became Osiris, joining his divine ancestors in the underworld, while his son became the new Horus. But the myths also established limits on royal power. The pharaoh had to maintain Ma'at, had to rule justly, had to perform the rituals correctly, had to ensure the Nile flooded and the sun rose and chaos remained at bay. He was divinely appointed, but not absolutely free. He served cosmic order as much as he commanded it. With Horus on the throne and set in his proper place, Egypt entered its golden age. Not historically, that would come later under actual pharaohs, but mythologically. This was when the divine order was perfected, when each god had their proper domain and function, when the relationship between the divine and earthly realms was clearly defined. Ra continued his daily journey across the sky in the solar bark, crossing the body of Nut from east to west, descending into the Duat at sunset to battle Apophis through 12 hours of night, emerging reborn each dawn. This daily cycle became the template for understanding time, resurrection, and the afterlife journey every human would eventually take. Osiris ruled the Duat, judging the dead in the Hall of Two Truths. The judgment scene depicted in countless tomb paintings and papyri, shows the deceased's heart being weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Anubis operates the scales. Thoth records the result. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the deceased lived justly, spoke truth, maintained Ma'at, they pass into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise where they can live forever in perfection. If the heart is heavy with sin, the monster Amit devours it, and the person experiences the second death, true annihilation. This judgment system profoundly shaped Egyptian ethics. What mattered wasn't just belief, but behavior. It was a comprehensive moral code enforced by cosmic consequences. The gods themselves specialized, developed distinct personalities and domains. Ptah of Memphis was the divine craftsman, patron of artists and builders. Thoth of Hermopolis was wisdom, writing, mathematics, timekeeping, magic. Hathor was love, joy, music, dance, intoxication, both nurturing mother and dangerous destroyer when roused. Sekhmet was war, plague, healing. Disease and cure came from the same source. Bastet was protection, fertility, the home. Sobek, the crocodile god, was strength and pharaonic power, but also the dangers of the Nile. Khnum crafted humans on his potter's wheel, determining their Ka, life force, and fate. Taweret protected mothers and children. Bes scared away demons and brought joy to households. These weren't abstract concepts, but active participants in daily life. People wore amulets of their protective gods, made offerings at household shrines, participated in festivals, visited temples for healing or oracles, commissioned prayers and spells from priests. The gods were real, present, powerful, and intensely relevant to survival and prosperity. Let me take you inside an Egyptian temple at dawn, because this is where theory became practice, where mythology translated into the machinery of maintaining cosmic order. The temple wasn't a church where congregations gathered for worship. It was the literal house of the god, a machine for sustaining Ma'at, and only priests could enter its inner sanctums. The morning ritual, performed daily in every major temple across Egypt, went like this. Before sunrise, the high priest purified himself in the sacred lake, shaved his entire body. Priests had to be ritually pure, which meant removing all body hair, dressed in clean linen, and approached the innermost sanctuary. He broke the clay seal on the shrine's doors, the same seal placed there the previous evening, and opened them to reveal the cult statue. The god residing within the statue had spent the night in darkness. Now the priest awakened them with hymns, presented offerings of food and drink, anointed the statue with oils, dressed it in fresh linen, applied cosmetics, and burned incense. This wasn't symbolic. The Egyptians genuinely believed the god's Ka inhabited the statue and required sustenance. After the morning ritual, the priests would seal the shrine again, and the god would rest until evening prayers. This daily routine maintained the contract between divine and human realms. The gods sustained the cosmos. Ra had to be strong enough to fight Apophis each night. The Nile needed divine will to flood. The sun needed offerings to rise. In return, humans provided the gods with sustenance through these rituals. It was reciprocal, transactional, necessary on both sides. But temples were more than ritual spaces. They were economic powerhouses. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, by the New Kingdom, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland, employed thousands of people, controlled vast herds of cattle, operated workshops that produced everything from bread to jewelry. Temples received donations from pharaohs, tribute from conquered territories, and offerings from ordinary people seeking divine favor. The temple hierarchy mirrored the cosmic hierarchy. At the top, the high priest, often a royal appointee, who could enter the inner sanctuary. Below him, ranks of priests with specialized functions. Lector priests who read the sacred texts. Sem priests who performed funerary rites. Wa'ib priests who maintained purity regulations. Below them, the temple staff, singers, musicians, artisans, farmers, guards, administrators. Women participated too, though differently than men. The god's wife of Amun was an enormously powerful position in Thebes, sometimes held by royal daughters, wielding authority equal to the high priest. Female musicians and singers performed in rituals, particularly for Hathor and other goddesses. Some women served as Sem priests in the cults of female deities. The priesthood required extensive training. Priests had to master hieroglyphic writing, different from the demotic script used for everyday business, understand ritual procedures, memorize prayers and hymns, learn astronomy to predict the Nile flood and calculate festival dates, study medicine, temples were healing centers, and maintain absolute ritual purity. Purity regulations were strict, priests abstaining from sex before rituals, bathing multiple times daily, shaving their bodies completely, wearing only linen, no wool, which came from animals and was considered impure, eating restricted diets, no pork, no certain fish species, and maintaining ritual cleanliness that separated them from ordinary people. Outside the temple, ordinary Egyptians interacted with the divine through different channels. They couldn't enter the inner sanctums, but they could participate in festivals when the cult statues were carried in procession through the streets. These festivals were spectacular. The Opet festival in Thebes, when Amun's statue journeyed from Karnak to Luxor Temple. The Festival of the Valley, when the gods crossed the Nile to visit the mortuary temples of dead kings. The Festival of Drunkenness, celebrating Hathor through music, dance, and lots of beer. People also visited the outer courts of temples to present offerings, seek oracles. The statue would be carried on priests' shoulders and would nod yes or no to questions, commission prayers, or simply experience the divine presence. They wore amulets, kept household shrines with figurines of protective deities, and participated in local cult practices that might differ significantly from official temple theology. The economic system underlying all this was sophisticated. Egypt was a redistributive economy, not a market economy in the modern sense. The pharaoh theoretically owned everything, all land, all resources, all production. In practice, he administered through a vast bureaucracy of nobles, scribes, and officials who managed regions, collected taxes, organized labor, and ensured grain storage for years of poor harvests. Taxes were paid in goods, a portion of the harvest, a share of cattle, a quota of labor days for public projects. Scribes meticulously recorded everything. The Nile flood was measured each year, and tax rates adjusted based on the expected harvest. Too high a flood could be as devastating as too low, washing away fields, destroying mud brick homes. The ideal was the moderate, predictable flood that left behind rich silt without causing destruction. Labor organization for major projects, pyramids, temples, irrigation systems, wasn't slavery, though Egypt did have slaves, usually foreign prisoners of war. It was corvée labor, required service that every Egyptian owed the pharaoh. During the inundation season, when fields were underwater and farm work was impossible, farmers could be conscripted to work on royal projects, fed and housed from royal granaries. This system produced the monuments we marvel at today, but it also required tremendous organizational capacity. Someone had to feed thousands of workers, provide tools, coordinate labor teams, transport massive stone blocks, and maintain work over decades. 5 tons each, quarried, transported, and precisely placed. The logistics are staggering even by modern standards, but infrastructure was about more than monuments. Irrigation systems captured and distributed the Nile's floodwaters. Grain silos stored surplus against famine years. Roads and river transport moved goods across the country. Fortresses defended borders. Mines in Sinai and Nubia extracted copper, gold, and turquoise. Trade networks reached Punt, probably modern Somalia, for incense, Lebanon for cedar wood, Afghanistan for lapis lazuli, and the Mediterranean world for silver. The writing system itself, hieroglyphics, was infrastructure for maintaining order. Sacred writing, the words of the gods, was how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Scribes were the elite, the educated class, exempt from manual labor, enjoying social prestige. Learning to write required years of training, memorizing over 700 hieroglyphic signs, mastering the cursive hieratic script for everyday use, studying model letters and literary texts. Medicine combined practical knowledge with magical practice. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains remarkably rational surgical instructions for treating wounds, setting bones, and recognizing symptoms. But treatment also involved spells, incantations, appeals to healing deities. Disease had natural and supernatural causes, both needed addressing. Law combined precedent with royal decree. There was no separate legal code like Hammurabi's. Law was based on previous cases, pharaonic edicts, and the principle of Ma'at. Courts operated at various levels, from local councils to the vizier's court to the pharaoh himself as supreme judge. Penalties ranged from fines to beatings to mutilation to execution, depending on the crime's severity. This entire elaborate system, religious, economic, political, social, existed to maintain Ma'at, to keep Egypt prosperous and the cosmos in balance. And for long stretches, it worked. The Old Kingdom, Seonis 2686 to 2181 BCE, saw pyramid building and centralized power. The Middle Kingdom, c. 2055 to 1650 BCE, brought cultural flowering and territorial expansion. The New Kingdom, c. 1550 to 1077 BCE, created an empire stretching from Nubia to Syria. But systems, no matter how well designed, contain the seeds of their own transformation. And Egypt's golden age, built on divine kingship and cosmic order, would eventually face challenges that no amount of ritual could prevent. Picture Thebes in the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BCE. The city sprawls along both banks of the Nile, dominated by the massive temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor. The morning sun catches the gilded tips of obelisks, flashes off painted reliefs covering every surface. The air fills with incense smoke, the sound of temple singers, the bustling activity of the world's most powerful civilization at its absolute peak. This is Egypt's imperial zenith. Ramesses II, who would rule for 67 years, has already fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh, established Egypt's authority over Canaan and Nubia, and begun building on a scale that makes even his predecessors look modest. Abu Simbel's 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each over 60 feet tall, dominate the Nubian frontier. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, covers acres on Thebes' west bank. At Karnak, his additions dwarf earlier construction. But the magnificence isn't just Ramesses' vanity, it's theology made visible. The pharaoh is Horus incarnate, son of Ra, living god. His building projects aren't monuments to ego, they're maintaining Ma'at through physical manifestation of divine order. Every stone placed, every relief carved, every offering made keeps the cosmos balanced, keeps chaos at bay, keeps Egypt prosperous. The Hymn to the Aten, composed earlier by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, captures the Egyptian sense of cosmic interconnection even as it promoted monotheistic revolution. How manifold it is, what thou hast made, they are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other. Though Akhenaten's revolution failed and his name was erased, the hymn reveals how Egyptians experienced the divine as overwhelming presence, creative force, sustainer of all existence. This wasn't abstract philosophy, but lived reality. When the sun rose, Ra was being born. When it set, he was dying. When the Nile flooded, the gods were blessing Egypt. When it failed, Mahat had been disrupted, and restoration required ritual intervention. The priesthood had grown enormously powerful. The high priest of Amun at Thebes wielded authority rivaling the pharaohs, controlling vast temple estates, commanding thousands of dependents, mediating between human and divine realms. The temple was a city within the city, workshops producing everything from bread to furniture, schools training scribes and priests, libraries preserving sacred texts, healing centers treating disease, astronomical observatories tracking the stars. Egyptian culture had reached extraordinary sophistication. Literature included wisdom texts, teaching proper conduct, tales of wonder, magical adventures, love poetry, remarkably sensual and tender, lamentations, questioning divine justice, and hymns, praising the gods. The tale of Sinuhe, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, the contendings of Horus and Set. These weren't primitive myths, but sophisticated narratives exploring identity, exile, homecoming, justice, and the relationship between fate and choice. Art had perfected its distinctive style, figures shown in canonical proportions, heads in profile with eyes frontal, torsos frontal with legs in profile, everything precisely ordered according to sacred geometry. This wasn't lack of skill or perspective, it was deliberate theological choice. Art was meant to capture the eternal essence of things, not their momentary appearance. A painted relief of the pharaoh wasn't a portrait. It was making the pharaoh's ka present for eternity. Medicine had developed treatments that wouldn't be improved on for millennia. Egyptian physicians could set broken bones, perform surgery, treat wounds, prescribe remedies for various ailments. They understood that the heart pumped blood through vessels throughout the body, knowledge Europe wouldn't rediscover until the 17th century. They practiced dentistry, including filling cavities and wiring loose teeth. Mathematics enabled the architectural achievements we still marvel at. Egyptians used a decimal system, understood fractions, could calculate areas and volumes, measured angles, and solved practical problems like determining the slope of a pyramid or dividing rations among workers. The Moscow mathematical papyrus and rind. Mathematical papyrus preserve their methods. Astronomy tracked the stars with precision. The Egyptian calendar had 365 days, 12 months of 30 days plus 5 epagomenal days, remarkably close to the true solar year. Priests could predict the Nile flood by watching Sirius's Heliacol rising, its first appearance in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility. They identified constellations, tracked planetary movements, and oriented temples to astronomical alignments. But perhaps the pinnacle of Egyptian achievement was their confrontation with death. No civilization has left such elaborate preparations for the afterlife, such detailed instructions for the journey, such confidence that death was not ending, but transformation. The Book of the Dead, properly called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, contains spells, passwords, and guidance for navigating the Duat. Different versions existed, some with hundreds of spells, commissioned by wealthy individuals and buried with them. The text described the challenges faced: gates guarded by demons who must be named correctly, serpents to be avoided, lakes of fire to cross, transformations to accomplish. The deceased had to pass through 12 gates, one for each hour of Ra's nightly journey. At each gate, they had to know the passwords, name the guardians, demonstrate knowledge of sacred texts. They had to transform into various forms: a lotus, a phoenix, a crocodile, each transformation giving specific powers needed for the journey. Finally, in the Hall of Two Truths, came the judgment. The heart, seat of emotion and will and memory, was weighed against Ma'at's feather. The deceased recited the negative confession, claiming innocence of wrongdoing. If the heart balanced the feather, they passed to the field of reeds, an idealized Egypt where the harvest was always abundant, the weather always perfect, existence eternally pleasant. This afterlife wasn't heaven in the Christian sense. No transcendence, no spiritual transformation, no unity with the divine. It was Egypt perfected, eternal continuation of earthly life's best moments. The deceased still needed food and drink, still had a body, still worked, though magical servant figurines, called shabtis, would do the work for them. The confidence this system demonstrated is remarkable. The Egyptians didn't hope for resurrection. They expected it, prepared for it, invested enormous resources in ensuring it. A pharaoh's tomb took decades to prepare, employed hundreds of workers, consumed vast wealth. Even modest Egyptians saved for proper burial, purchased amulets and modest papyri with essential spells arranged for offerings to be made at their tombs. This confidence came from the myths. If Osiris could be resurrected, if he could rule the afterlife despite being murdered and dismembered, then every Egyptian properly prepared could achieve the same transformation. The rituals Isis performed on Osiris's body were replicated on every mummy. The spells she spoke were written in the tombs. The journey Osiris took to the Duat was the path everyone would follow. At Egypt's pinnacle, around 1250 BCE, this entire elaborate system seemed eternal. The Nile had flooded reliably for millennia. The pharaohs had ruled for over 2,000 years already. The gods were present, active, responsive to ritual. The temples were wealthy beyond measure. The borders were secure. The afterlife was guaranteed for those who prepared properly. Standing in Karnak's great hypostyle hall, surrounded by 134 columns reaching 70 feet high, each carved with hieroglyphs and painted in brilliant colors, you would feel the weight of divine order made manifest. This wasn't human achievement alone, it was collaboration between human and divine, physical proof that Ma'at prevailed, that Egypt was the center of the world, that the gods had chosen this land and these people for eternal blessing. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, referring to the rich dark soil left by the Nile's flood. Beyond it stretched the Deshret, the red land of desert, domain of Set and chaos. This geographical reality shaped their worldview. Egypt was the ordered cosmos, the narrow ribbon of life surrounded by infinite death, maintained through constant vigilance and ritual. In the royal palace, scribes recorded everything. Each title invoked divine authority, cosmic function, historical continuity. The pharaoh's day was ritualized from waking to sleeping. He rose before dawn to greet Ra's birth. He performed the morning temple rituals or had priests do so in his name. He held audiences, dispensed justice, reviewed construction projects, received foreign emissaries, studied reports from provincial governors, planned military campaigns, commissioned monuments, and constantly, ceaselessly, maintained Ma'at through right action, right speech, right ritual. But he was also human, or partly so. The royal succession created living gods from mortal men. His ka was different from ordinary humans, connected directly to divine power. Yet he still ate, slept, aged, made decisions, felt emotions, experienced doubt. This tension between divine and human appears in the literature. In the tale of the eloquent peasant, a humble farmer pleads his case before officials with such rhetorical skill that they keep delaying judgment just to hear more of his speeches. Eventually, the case reaches the pharaoh, who rewards the peasant not just with justice but with gifts honoring his eloquence. The story shows a king who values ma'at, who listens even to the lowliest subject, who rules justly. But it also reveals that such behavior was aspirational, worth celebrating in story, precisely because it wasn't always practiced. The pessimistic literature of the first intermediate period, when central authority collapsed and Egypt fragmented into competing regions, shows the flip side. Texts like the Admonitions of Epua lament that the land turns around as does a potter's wheel. Servants have become mistresses. When Mahat failed, when the pharaoh was weak or absent, when the gods seemed distant, everything collapsed into chaos. But at the pinnacle, under strong pharaohs, with full treasuries and secure borders, such worries seemed distant. Foreign tribute flowed into Egypt, gold from Nubia, silver from the north, exotic goods from Punt. Egyptian armies dominated the Near East. Egyptian merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean. The Egyptian language and writing system spread beyond Egypt's borders. Egyptian gods gained worshippers in foreign lands. The cult of Amun, in particular, had grown from a local Theban deity to king of the gods, sometimes merged with Ra as Amun-Ra, the hidden one who manifests as the sun. The priesthood of Amun controlled resources rivaling the pharaoh's own. The annual Opet festival, when Amun's statue processed from Karnak to Luxor Temple, was Egypt's greatest celebration. Weeks of feasting, music, dancing, religious ecstasy as God and people came together in joyful communion. Women in elite families enjoyed remarkable autonomy compared to most ancient societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, serve as priestesses, and occasionally rule as pharaohs, Hatshepsut being the most famous. The love poetry from this period shows relationships of genuine affection, mutual desire, and partnership. The voice of the turtle dove speaks out. "Indeed, you birds, do not disturb me. I have found my brother in his bed." This was a civilization that valued order but also celebrated joy, music, dance, festivals, good food, fine beer, the pleasures of gardens and shade, family, friendship, love. The afterlife they prepared for was explicitly sensual and embodied, not a transcendent spiritual realm, but a perfected version of earthly existence. The gods themselves exhibited the full range of human emotion while remaining divine. Ra grew old each day and needed rejuvenation each night. Hathor could be loving mother or raging destroyer. Isis mourned, strategized, performed magic, raised a child. Osiris died, was restored, and ruled with wisdom born from suffering. These weren't remote, perfect beings, but intensely relatable presences who nevertheless commanded awe and devotion. At the pinnacle, Egyptians believed, truly believed, that this would continue forever. The myths taught that the gods established Egypt at creation, that the Nile was their gift, that the pharaoh was their representative, that proper ritual maintained cosmic order. 2,000 years of relatively stable civilization seemed to prove it. Yes, there had been disruptions, the intermediate periods when central authority weakened, but Egypt always recovered, always restored Ma'at, always endured. But civilizations, like individual humans, are mortal, and the forces that would challenge Egypt's eternal order were already gathering, both from within and without. The first hairline fractures in Egypt's cosmic order appeared not as dramatic catastrophes, but as subtle shifts, easy to dismiss, difficult to recognize as symptoms of deeper transformation. Around 1077 BCE, as the new kingdom's vigor waned, the high priest of Amun at Thebes effectively controlled Upper Egypt while the pharaoh ruled from the delta. Egypt hadn't split officially, but authority had fragmented. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate. Divine kingship meant centralized, absolute authority blessed by the gods. But when the priesthood of Amun commanded wealth rivaling the crown, when temple lands comprised huge portions of Egypt's agricultural base, when the high priest could challenge royal decrees with religious authority, the theoretical unity of divine and earthly power fractured. The theological implications troubled thoughtful Egyptians. If the pharaoh was truly divine, how could priests dispute his authority? If Mahat required proper order, what happened when different authorities claimed to represent order? The texts don't give us much insight into these doubts. Egyptian literature rarely questioned official ideology openly, but we can sense the tension in how scribes carefully navigated language about authority and legitimacy. External pressures mounted as well. The late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, had devastated civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. City after city fell to the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders whose origins remain debated. Egypt survived. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples in a series of desperate battles, but the effort exhausted the treasury and exposed Egypt's vulnerability. The documents from this period reveal economic strain. Workers building royal tombs in Deir el-Medina went on strike, possibly history's first recorded labor action, because their grain rations hadn't been delivered. The strike succeeded, but the very fact that workers felt compelled to withhold labor suggests the social contract was fraying. When the pharaoh couldn't provide basic necessities, what did that say about divine authority and cosmic order? Tomb robbery became endemic during the Third Intermediate Period. The sacred violation of royal burials, the very bodies and treasures meant to sustain the dead pharaohs through eternity, was prosecuted vigorously, but the trials themselves reveal how widespread the problem was. Ordinary people, desperate from economic hardship, risked execution to steal from tombs. Worse, officials often participated or accepted bribes to ignore robberies. Think about what this meant psychologically. The tombs were supposed to be eternal houses, protected by magic and divine curses. The mummies were supposed to be immortal vessels for the deceased's ka. But when robbers violated tombs, scattered the mummies, melted down the gold, and nothing divine struck them down, when they got away with it, even prospered, it suggested the magic wasn't working, the gods weren't protecting their faithful, the promises of resurrection might be uncertain. Foreign dynasties began ruling portions of Egypt. Libyan chiefs, descendants of mercenaries who'd settled in the delta, established the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, c. 945 to 715 BCE. They adopted Egyptian titles, performed Egyptian rituals, claimed legitimacy through the same divine kingship ideology, but they weren't ethnically Egyptian. Could a Libyan truly be Horus incarnate? The priests said yes, emphasizing ritual over blood, but the question itself revealed transformation. Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, c. 747-656 BCE, conquered Egypt from the south, reversing millennia of Egyptian domination over Nubia. These black pharaohs were arguably more devout Egyptians than recent native rulers, restoring old temples, reviving ancient rituals, claiming to purify Egypt of corruption. But again, the fact that they needed to conquer Egypt to rule it, that military force rather than automatic divine succession determined kingship suggested the old order was dissolving. The gods themselves seemed more distant. Late period texts show increasing emphasis on personal piety, direct relationship with deities, private prayers rather than state ritual. This might seem like spiritual deepening, but it also suggests the grand temple system wasn't fully satisfying religious needs. When individuals sought personal connection with gods, it implied the official intermediaries, priests, rituals, massive state ceremonies weren't sufficient. Animal cults proliferated during this period. Egyptians had always revered certain animals as manifestations of gods, the Apis bull as Ptah incarnate, crocodiles as Sobek, cats as Bastet. But now, animal mummies multiplied exponentially. Millions of ibises were mummified for Thoth, millions of cats for Bastet, falcons for Horus, dogs for Anubis. This suggests both desperate devotion, people seeking divine favor through animal offerings, and possibly commercialization, priests breeding and selling animals specifically for mummification. The intellectual traditions also showed strain. The Demotic Chronicle from the Ptolemaic period looks back at earlier dynasties with pessimism, suggesting good pharaohs were rare exceptions rather than the norm. Wisdom literature became more cynical, less confident about Ma'at's ultimate triumph. The old certainties, that right action led to prosperity, that the gods rewarded virtue, that Egypt was eternally blessed, faced empirical challenges. Climate may have played a role too. Nile flood patterns shifted during the first millennium BCE. Years of low floods meant famine, tax collection failures, economic strain, social unrest. Years of excessive floods destroyed infrastructure, washed away topsoil, caused different but equally devastating problems. When the agricultural base, the foundation of Egypt's wealth, became unreliable, everything else became uncertain. The Persian conquest in 525 BCE was shock on an entirely different scale. The Achaemenid Empire absorbed Egypt as a province. Yes, the Persian kings claimed pharaonic titles, performed some Egyptian rituals, respected Egyptian gods, at least officially, but Egypt was no longer independent, no longer the center of its own world, but a periphery in someone else's empire. The violation went deeper than political sovereignty. If the pharaoh was Horus incarnate, divinely ordained to rule Egypt eternally, how could foreign kings overthrow him? If Mahat meant Egypt's cosmic centrality, what did Persian rule mean about the god's power? Some priests developed theology explaining the Persians as divine punishment for Egyptian sins, a crisis meant to purify and restore Egypt, but this required admitting profound failure of the system that supposedly maintained cosmic order. Egyptian uprisings against Persian rule showed the tension. The revolts weren't just political resistance, they were theological statements, attempts to restore proper order, to reinstall native pharaohs as Horus incarnate. When the revolts failed, when Persian armies crushed Egyptian forces despite Egyptian prayers and rituals and divine support, it suggested the gods couldn't or wouldn't intervene. Yet Egyptian religion endured, adapted, continued. The priests maintained rituals even under foreign rule. The people continued worshipping the gods, preparing for the afterlife, preserving traditions. But something fundamental had shifted. The confident assurance that Egypt was eternal, that the gods guaranteed Egyptian supremacy, that proper ritual maintained cosmic order, this certainty had cracked, letting in doubts that would widen into chasms. Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, and the priests welcomed him as liberator from hated Persian rule. At the Oracle of Siwa, in the western desert, Alexander consulted the Oracle of Amun, who, so Alexander claimed, declared him son of the god. The young Macedonian became pharaoh, performed Egyptian rituals, founded Alexandria at the Nile's western mouth, and then left, heading east to conquer more of the world, leaving Egypt in the hands of Macedonian administrators. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian royal titles and iconography, built temples in traditional Egyptian style, supported the priesthoods, participated in festivals, but they spoke Greek, governed through Greek bureaucracy, and oriented Egypt's wealth toward Mediterranean trade rather than the Nile Valley's ancient rhythms. This was conquest through assimilation rather than destruction. The Ptolemies needed Egyptian cooperation, particularly from the powerful priesthoods who controlled vast resources and commanded popular loyalty. So they negotiated, granting privileges to temples in exchange for legitimacy. The Rosetta Stone, created in 196 BCE, exemplifies this collaboration, a decree honoring Ptolemy V recorded in hieroglyphics, Demotic Egyptian and Greek, each script addressing different audiences within the same kingdom. But Alexandria, not Memphis or Thebes, became the capital. Alexandria was Mediterranean, cosmopolitan, Greek-speaking, oriented toward the wider Hellenistic world. The famous Library of Alexandria gathered texts from throughout the known world, pursuing universal knowledge rather than purely Egyptian tradition. The Pharaoh's Lighthouse, one of the ancient world's wonders, guided ships from across the Mediterranean to Alexandria's harbours, symbols of Egypt's reorientation from Nile-centered to sea-facing. Egyptian and Greek culture mixed in complex ways. Serapis, a syncretic deity combining Osiris and the Greek Apis bull, was promoted by Ptolemy I as a god both Egyptians and Greeks could worship. The cult succeeded among Greeks and Hellenized Egyptians, but never fully replaced traditional Egyptian devotion to Osiris. Greek philosophers studied Egyptian wisdom, interpreting hieroglyphics, often wildly incorrectly, as mystical symbols encoding profound truths. Egyptian priests learned Greek to access Hellenistic learning. But beneath the cultural exchange lay power inequalities. Greeks and Macedonians dominated administration, military command, and commerce. Egyptians, even elite ones, were largely excluded from top positions. Tax rates remained high, supporting the Ptolemaic court's Hellenistic ambitions rather than Egyptian temples. Revolts erupted repeatedly in Upper Egypt, where traditional Egyptian culture remained strongest, where resentment against Greek rule burned hot. The religious implications were profound. Ptolemaic pharaohs performed Egyptian rituals when necessary, but didn't embrace Egyptian theology with the devotion native pharaohs had shown. They were pragmatic rulers using religion as political tool rather than genuine believers in their own divine transformation. The gap between official ideology, Pharaoh as Horus incarnate, and practical reality, Greek king paying lip service to Egyptian customs, was obvious to observant Egyptians. Temple construction continued. The Ptolemies built or expanded temples at Edfu, Dendera, Philae, and elsewhere. But look closely at the reliefs. Ptolemaic rulers shown in traditional Egyptian style, performing traditional rituals, but the hieroglyphic texts sometimes contain errors, suggesting declining expertise or perhaps deliberate archising, attempting to recreate an idealized past rather than continuing a living tradition. The Egyptian language itself was transforming. Demotic script, used for everyday writing, was diverging significantly from the hieroglyphics used in temples. Coptic, written in Greek letters with added characters for Egyptian sounds, was developing as a new script. Greek loanwords entered Egyptian vocabulary. The linguistic unity that had helped maintain cultural continuity for 3 millennia was fragmenting. Economic changes accelerated the transformation. Ptolemaic Egypt integrated into Mediterranean trade networks, exporting grain to feed Greek cities, importing silver, wine, olive oil, manufactured goods. This brought wealth. Alexandria became one of the ancient world's richest cities, but the wealth concentrated in Greek hands and coastal cities, while traditional Egyptian regions inland sometimes stagnated. The cosmopolitan mixing in Alexandria produced remarkable intellectual achievements. Euclid developed geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Callimachus catalogued the library's holdings. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the Argonautica. But this was Greek achievement in Egyptian territory rather than Egyptian achievement per se. The distinctive Egyptian approach to knowledge, practical, empirical, embedded in religious context, was being superseded by Greek theoretical abstraction. Egyptian mythology began appearing in Greek retellings, filtered through Hellenistic sensibilities. Plutarch's On Isis and Osiris, written in the 1st century CE, presents the Egyptian myths, but interprets them through Greek philosophical categories, finding in them allegories about matter and spirit, nature and reason, mortality and immortality. This wasn't quite what the myths originally meant, but it was how educated Mediterraneans increasingly encountered them. When Rome absorbed Egypt after Cleopatra VII's defeat in 30 BCE, the transformation accelerated. Egypt became Rome's breadbasket, taxed heavily to feed the imperial capital. Roman emperors took the title of pharaoh, but rarely visited Egypt, governing through prefects. The temples continued functioning, but faced increasing financial pressure as Roman authorities diverted resources. Christianity's arrival brought catastrophic change for traditional Egyptian religion. Initially, Christianity was just another foreign cult among many competing in Alexandria and the Delta. But as it spread, particularly among Egyptians seeking alternatives to the Greco-Roman elite's culture, it directly challenged traditional Egyptian beliefs about the gods, the afterlife, and cosmic order. Christian theology was fundamentally incompatible with Egyptian polytheism. There was one god, not many gods. Worship of other deities was idolatry, damnation-worthy sin. The elaborate Egyptian afterlife system, judgment by Osiris, spells from the Book of the Dead, mummification to preserve the body, was rejected in favor of resurrection of the dead at Christ's return. The pharaoh wasn't divine. Only Jesus was God incarnate. Early persecution of Christians in Egypt, particularly under Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, ironically strengthened Christianity by creating martyrs whose devotion impressed observers. But when Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE and Theodosius I made it the Roman Empire's official religion by 380 CE, the power dynamic reversed dramatically. Now traditional Egyptian religion faced persecution. Temples were closed, defaced, converted to churches. Priests were forbidden to practice traditional rituals. Hieroglyphic writing, the sacred script, ceased being taught. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription is from 394 CE at Philae Temple. Within a few generations, knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics was lost, taking with it direct access to 3,000 years of Egyptian wisdom encoded in those elegant, mysterious symbols. The old gods were demonized. Demons weren't minor chaotic forces to be controlled through magic, they were fallen angels serving Satan. The animal-headed deities became evidence of paganism's absurdity. How could anyone worship gods with jackal heads or ibis heads when the true God was beyond representation? The sophisticated theological reasons for Egyptian iconography, representing divine attributes, making abstract concepts concrete, were dismissed or misunderstood. Yet Egyptian Christianity, Coptic Christianity, preserved elements of the older tradition. The Ankh symbol was adopted as a cross variant. Mary nursing Jesus echoed Isis nursing Horus. Some scholars suggest Isis iconography influenced Mary depictions. Monasticism, which became central to Christian practice, may have drawn on traditions of Egyptian hermits and wise ascetics. The Coptic language preserved spoken Egyptian, even as hieroglyphics vanished. By 500 CE, the Egypt of the pharaohs, of Osiris, and Ra and Isis, of divine kingship and cosmic order maintained through ritual, of pyramids and temples and books of the dead, that Egypt was effectively gone. The physical monuments remained, increasingly mysterious to people who couldn't read the inscriptions covering them. The myths survived in Greek and Latin retellings, but disconnected from living belief. The mummies lay in their tombs, some already looted, others awaiting future grave robbers or archaeologists. What had seemed eternal, 2,000 years is longer than most civilizations survive, had ended, not through dramatic apocalypse, but through gradual transformation, foreign rule, cultural mixing, economic reorientation, religious replacement, and finally, forgetting. The temple of Isis at Philae, an island sanctuary in the Nile near Aswan, remained the last bastion of traditional Egyptian religion well into the 6th century CE, centuries after Christianity had become dominant throughout the empire. The Blemis and Nobatae, tribal groups from Nubia, had negotiated special permission to continue worshipping Isis there, recognizing her shrine as sacred ground even as churches rose throughout Egypt. In 535 CE, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian ordered the temple closed. His general, Narses, led troops to Philae, expelled the priests, and converted the temple to a church dedicated to Saint Stephen. This wasn't battlefield conquest, but bureaucratic enforcement of religious monopoly. There was no battle, no dramatic last stand, just officials arriving, decrees being read, priests being forced out, altars being toppled. Imagine being the last priest of Isis, watching as soldiers deface the reliefs your predecessors had maintained for centuries, as Christian monks whitewash the painted ceilings, as the cult statue, the physical vessel of the goddess herself, is removed and destroyed. Everything you'd been trained for, everything your lineage had preserved through multiple foreign conquests and cultural upheavals, ending not because the goddess was defeated by a stronger god, but because political authority simply decreed your practices illegal. This was the breaking point not as cataclysm, but as bureaucratic memo, as military enforcement of religious uniformity, as the final severing of the thread connecting living practice to ancient origin. With Philae's closure, there were no more functioning Egyptian temples, no more priests performing the daily rituals, no more offerings presented to the gods, no more festivals celebrating the divine mysteries. But the breaking point had really occurred earlier, when hieroglyphic writing ceased. Language is how complex cultural knowledge transfers across generations. When the last person who could read hieroglyphics died sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century CE, 3,000 years of recorded wisdom became locked away, inaccessible, mysterious marks that decorated ancient monuments but conveyed no meaning. Imagine the gradual realization among educated Egyptians that the sacred writing was being forgotten. The priests who knew hieroglyphics were aging, dying, and fewer young people were learning. Perhaps there were attempts to preserve the knowledge. Surely someone copied out teaching texts, created glossaries, tried to bridge the gap. But in a world where Christianity was ascendant, where classical Greek and Latin were the prestigious literary languages, where Coptic served for vernacular Egyptian, who would invest years learning an obsolete script serving forbidden gods. Within a few generations, Egypt became foreign to itself. Coptic Christians living beside the pyramids had no idea who built them. Fantastic legends emerged. They were Joseph's granaries. They were antediluvian monuments built by giants. They were treasure troves guarded by magic. The truth that Egyptian pharaohs had built them as tombs, that the hieroglyphic inscriptions explained who and when and why, was lost. The mummies too became mysterious. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans ground them into powder for medicine, believing they had healing properties. This wasn't sacrilege in their eyes, because they had no concept of what the mummies represented: preserved bodies awaiting resurrection, vessels for eternal souls, physical anchors for the deceased's ka. They were just oddly preserved corpses, valuable as curiosities or medicinal ingredients. The gods became literary references divorced from living belief. Greek and Roman authors had written about Egyptian religion: Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and these texts preserved the myths in outline. But reading about Osiris's death and resurrection in a philosophical treatise is entirely different from participating in annual rituals reenacting the mystery, from feeling the emotional power of Isis's grief, from believing your own resurrection depends on Osiris's successful navigation of the underworld. Islam's arrival in Egypt during the 7th century CE added another layer of transformation. Arabic replaced Coptic as the dominant language, though Coptic survived in church liturgy. Islamic civilization valued different aspects of Egypt's heritage than Christianity had, less interested in ancient religion, but fascinated by ancient science, architecture, and engineering. Arab scholars preserved some classical knowledge about ancient Egypt, but always filtered through Islamic worldview, always understanding it as pre-Islamic ignorance, jahiliyyah, superseded by divine revelation. The medieval Islamic world saw Egypt's monuments with wonder, but not comprehension. The pyramids were marvels of human ingenuity, but also sources of speculation about treasure, magic, lost knowledge. The Sphinx became Abu al-Hol, father of terror, its original meaning and function forgotten. Hieroglyphics were mysterious symbols that surely encoded profound wisdom, alchemical secrets, astrological knowledge, hermetic philosophy, but actual reading of them remained impossible. European interest in Egypt revived during the Renaissance, but through the lens of Hermeticism and occultism rather than historical accuracy. The Corpus Hermeticum, supposedly ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, were actually Greek philosophical works from the 2nd to 3rd centuries CE. But Renaissance scholars didn't know that. They believed they were recovering genuine Egyptian mysteries, ancient wisdom predating even Moses, knowledge that could unlock the universe's secrets. The tragic irony is that genuine Egyptian wisdom, medical texts, mathematical treatises, ethical teachings, astronomical observations, architectural principles, 3 millennia of accumulated knowledge, lay literally written on the walls of monuments, buried in tombs, preserved in papyri, completely inaccessible because no one could read the language. The knowledge Europeans desperately sought through esoteric speculation was physically present but linguistically locked away. Napoleon's Egyptian expedition in 1798 marks the beginning of modern Egyptology, though not immediately. Napoleon brought scholars who documented monuments systematically, making detailed drawings, copying inscriptions, but they still couldn't read hieroglyphics. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers in 1799, provided the crucial key: the same decree in Greek, readable, and hieroglyphics, mysterious, enabling eventual decipherment. Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in 1822, cracking the hieroglyphic code, was itself a kind of resurrection. Suddenly, the ancient Egyptians could speak again. Their own words, their own thoughts, their recorded history rather than Greek retellings, all became accessible for the first time in 1,400 years. The dead language lived again, though now as an object of scholarly study rather than living practice. But this resurrection was incomplete, fragmentary, archaeological rather than spiritual. We can read what they wrote, see what they built, recover their history, analyze their myths. But we can't recover the lived experience of believing those myths, of feeling the gods' presence, of confidently preparing for an afterlife we genuinely expect, of experiencing the Nile's flood as divine blessing rather than hydraulic phenomenon. The breaking point wasn't a moment but a process. Temples closing over decades, priests dying without successors, children not learning the old ways, inscriptions becoming unreadable, rituals ceasing, beliefs transforming, memory fading, until finally the continuous thread connecting the present to the ancient past simply broke, leaving ruins, texts, and monuments whose original meaning required scholarly reconstruction to even partially recover. When the last temple closed and the last hieroglyphic text was written, Egyptian mythology didn't vanish completely. It scattered, transformed, survived in unexpected forms. Like Osiris's dismembered body, pieces of the tradition dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, waiting for someone to gather them together again. The most direct continuation came through Coptic Christianity, Egypt's distinctive Christian tradition. The Coptic language was Egyptian, written in Greek letters, preserving the spoken language even as hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts died. Coptic Christians maintained continuity with the pharaonic past in ways they might not have fully recognized. Their monasticism echoed ancient Egyptian desert hermits. Their veneration of Mary resonated with Isis worship. Their cross designs sometimes incorporated the Ankh, and their calendar preserved ancient Egyptian month names. The Coptic Museum in Cairo preserves textiles showing figures in traditional Egyptian poses but holding Christian symbols, manuscripts blending Egyptian and Christian iconography, objects demonstrating cultural continuity despite religious transformation. When modern Egyptian Christians call themselves Coptic, from Egyptios, Greek for Egyptian, they're claiming direct descent from pharaonic ancestors, maintaining they're the true Egyptians, preserving ancient heritage. But Egyptian mythology's influence extended far beyond Egypt. The Isis cult had spread throughout the Roman Empire before Christianity's triumph. Temples to Isis existed from Londinium, London, to Pompeii, from the Rhine frontier to Spain. She became a universal goddess, she of 10,000 names, absorbing attributes of dozens of local deities. Roman women especially embraced her worship, finding in Isis a powerful feminine divine figure offering protection, magic, and initiation into mysteries promising salvation. When Apuleius wrote The Golden Ass in the 2nd century CE, he concluded with his protagonist's ecstatic conversion to Isis worship. The novel's description of Isiac initiation ceremonies, veiled in secrecy but hinting at profound transformation, death and rebirth, descent and ascension, preserved the emotional power of the Egyptian mystery tradition even as the author Romanized and allegorized the content. Hermetic philosophy, claiming Egyptian origins, influenced Renaissance magic, alchemy, and esotericism. Although the Corpus Hermeticum was actually Hellenistic rather than genuinely ancient Egyptian, it channeled Egyptian prestige and mystique into European intellectual history. When Marsilio Ficino translated the Hermetica in 1471, he believed he was recovering pre-Mosaic wisdom from ancient Egypt. This fiction influenced figures from Giordano Bruno to Isaac Newton, embedding supposed Egyptian mysteries into the foundations of early modern science and philosophy. Freemasonry adopted Egyptian symbolism. Pyramids, sphinxes, hieroglyphics, temples, initiation mysteries supposedly derived from ancient Egyptian practices. Whether or not actual Egyptian influence existed, scholarly consensus says no. Freemasons believed they were preserving ancient wisdom, and this belief shaped their symbolism, rituals, and architecture. Egyptian revival architecture in 18th and 19th century Europe and America reflected this fascination. The artifacts themselves dispersed globally as museums and private collectors acquired Egyptian objects. Mummies became curiosities displayed in European collections. Obelisks were transported to Rome, Paris, London, New York. Physical pieces of Egypt relocated to foreign capitals. Napoleon's expedition began the flood of Egyptian artifacts to European museums, where they became objects of study, wonder, and colonial appropriation. The papyri, both religious and secular, scattered into library collections worldwide. The Book of the Dead papyri, funerary texts once buried with specific individuals to guide their afterlife journey, became museum display pieces and scholarly resources. The Ebers papyrus, medicine, the Rind mathematical papyrus, the Westcar papyrus, magic tales, the teachings of Ptah-hotep, wisdom literature, all survived because they were taken from Egypt and preserved in institutions that could protect them. This preservation was simultaneously rescue and theft, scholarship and colonialism. Egyptian artifacts in European museums were saved from destruction by time, by treasure hunters, by Egyptian farmers using ancient stone for building materials. But they were also removed from their original context, claimed by foreign powers, displayed to assert colonial dominance. The debates continue today about whether these objects should be repatriated or remain in institutions that can conserve them for global audiences. The myths themselves survived through multiple transmission paths. Classical authors, especially Plutarch's On Isis and Osiris, preserved outline accounts accessible to anyone reading Greek or Latin. These weren't complete or entirely accurate, but maintained awareness of the main narratives. Osiris murdered by Set, Isis searching for the body, Horus avenging his father, the judgment of the dead, the solar bark's journey through night. When Champollion deciphered hieroglyphics in 1822, Egyptian mythology became accessible in unprecedented detail. The pyramid texts, Old Kingdom funerary inscriptions, coffin texts, Middle Kingdom, and Book of the Dead, New Kingdom and later, could be translated, revealing elaborate cosmologies, creation myths, afterlife geography, divine relationships, ritual procedures. 19th century scholars raced to translate and publish, making 3,000 years of Egyptian religious literature available to modern readers. But translation isn't understanding. Reading the Book of the Dead as academic text is vastly different from believing it guides real souls through real dangers to real judgment. We can analyze the contendings of Horus and Set as myth, but we can't experience it as scripture. We can study tomb paintings showing the deceased worshipping various deities, but we can't feel the hope and fear motivating those images' creation. Some Egyptian religious practices survived in garbled forms. The Eye of Horus amulet remains popular jewelry, though wearers rarely know they're invoking a god's restored eye as protection symbol. Pyramid energy theories, claims about ancient Egyptian mystical knowledge, New Age appropriations of Egyptian spirituality, these are modern inventions bearing little relation to historical belief, but they demonstrate the enduring mystique of ancient Egypt. Academic Egyptology reconstructed the mythology through rigorous scholarship. E. A. Wallace Budge, though his translations are now considered unreliable, popularized Egyptian texts in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Scholars like Jan Assmann, Eric Hornung, and John Baines analyzed Egyptian theology systematically, revealing its sophistication, complexity, and evolution over millennia. We now know more about Egyptian religion than any medieval scholar did, more even than many ancient Greeks and Romans knew. But as external observers analysing a dead tradition rather than as participants experiencing living faith, museums like the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, and countless smaller institutions house the physical remnants, statues of gods, mummy cases painted with protective deities, papyri covered with prayers and spells, amulets, offering tables, canopic jars, jewelry, cosmetics, furniture. The material culture of a religious civilization preserved after the beliefs animating it have died. The tombs themselves, excavated and studied, reveal Egyptian attitudes toward death and eternity with extraordinary intimacy. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered nearly intact in 1922, showed the wealth and care invested in preserving the young pharaoh for eternity. The painted tombs in the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens display the afterlife journey in vivid detail. The workers' tombs at Deir el-Medina show how even non-elite Egyptians prepared for the same destination as pharaohs, believing the same gods would judge them, the same paradise awaited if they passed. What remained ultimately was fragments. Immense, informative, beautiful fragments, but fragments nonetheless. We have more Egyptian monuments, texts, and artifacts than from most ancient civilizations. We can reconstruct the religion in remarkable detail, but we cannot resurrect the lived experience, the emotional reality, the cultural context in which these beliefs made complete sense, offered genuine comfort, commanded sincere devotion, and organized an entire civilization's understanding of existence. The Egyptian mythology that died as living belief was reborn as cultural inheritance, influencing civilizations that superseded it in ways both obvious and subtle. The afterlife of Egyptian religion, paradoxically, demonstrates the very principle it taught, that death isn't ending but transformation, that properly preserved ideas can resurrect in new contexts. Greek philosophy absorbed Egyptian influence, though Greeks often misunderstood or reimagined what they learned. Pythagoras supposedly studied in Egypt, learning mathematics and mystical doctrines. Plato's philosophy of ideal forms contrasted with material reality might echo Egyptian concepts of divine archetypes manifested in physical creation. The Orphic mysteries, with their emphasis on death, rebirth, and judgment of souls, parallel Egyptian funerary beliefs, though direct influence is debated. More concretely, Greek intellectuals visited Egypt, studied there, wrote about it. Herodotus toured Egypt around 450 BCE, recording Egyptian customs, religion, and history with mixed accuracy. He recognized Egyptian civilization's antiquity and sophistication, noting practices like mummification with fascinated horror. Though his information contains errors and exaggerations, he preserved details about Egyptian religion that would otherwise be lost. The Library of Alexandria, though Greek-directed, preserved Egyptian knowledge alongside texts from throughout the Mediterranean world. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, compiled king lists and histories that remain our primary framework for Egyptian chronology. His work adapted Egyptian tradition for Greek audiences, translating Egyptian thought into Hellenistic categories. Jewish and Christian traditions intersected with Egyptian legacy in complex ways. The Hebrew Bible contains Egyptian influences, Moses' upbringing in Pharaoh's court, the Exodus narrative set in Egypt, wisdom literature that parallels Egyptian teachings. Some scholars see Egyptian influence on Jewish monotheism, particularly during the period when Israelites lived in Egypt, though this remains contentious. Early Christianity developed partly in Egypt. The Gospel of Mark was supposedly written in Alexandria. The Coptic Church claims foundation by St. Mark himself. Egyptian Christianity developed distinctive characteristics: intense monasticism, theological sophistication that produced influential thinkers like Origen and Athanasius, strong emphasis on martyrdom and asceticism. The philosophical school in Alexandria synthesized Platonic, Stoic, peripatetic, and religious ideas into Neoplatonism, influencing both pagan and Christian thought. Plotinus, though Roman, studied in Alexandria and taught philosophy melding Greek rational inquiry with mystical insights. His hierarchical cosmos, the One, the Nous, divine mind, the world soul, reinterpreted Plato but also resonated with Egyptian concepts of divine emanation and cosmic order. Islamic civilization, when it absorbed Egypt, engaged thoughtfully with pharaonic heritage. Arab historians recorded what they learned about ancient Egypt. The pyramids and other monuments impressed Islamic scholars as marvels of ancient engineering and architecture. Though Islam rejected ancient Egyptian religion as jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, it acknowledged the civilization's achievements. Medieval European imagination incorporated Egypt as land of ancient wisdom and mystery. The Arthurian legends include Egyptian elements. Alchemists claimed their art originated in Egypt with Hermes Trismegistus. Astrologers traced their knowledge to ancient Egypt. These claims were mostly fictional, but they demonstrate how Egypt functioned as source of ancient authority and esoteric knowledge. The Renaissance fascination with Egypt intensified as classical texts were rediscovered. Humanists read Plutarch on Isis and Osiris, Plato's references to Egypt, Herodotus's descriptions. Artists incorporated Egyptian motifs, obelisks, hieroglyphics, unreadable but decorative, sphinxes, pyramids, into their works. Rome's ancient Egyptian obelisks were re-erected in Christian contexts, with crosses added to their peaks, adapting pagan monuments to Christian purpose. The 18th century's Enlightenment saw Egypt as birthplace of civilization, source of geometry, astronomy, philosophy. Mozart's The Magic Flute draws on Masonic Egyptian symbolism, presenting Egyptianized mystery initiation as metaphor for enlightenment. The opera, though wildly inaccurate about actual Egyptian religion, demonstrates Egypt's imaginative power in European culture. Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, 1798 to 1801, inaugurated modern Egyptology, but also sparked Egyptomania in European culture. The multi-volume Description de l'Egypte, 1809 to 1829, documented Egypt's monuments systematically. Empire-style furniture incorporated Egyptian motifs. Architecture adopted Egyptian elements. The West was rediscovering ancient Egypt, though initially through romantic and imperialist lenses. Champollion's decipherment transformed how we could access Egyptian thought. Suddenly, the ancients could speak for themselves in their own words, not filtered through Greek or Roman interpreters. This was revolutionary. Primary sources directly revealing 3 millennia of civilization's beliefs, practices, values, and history. The Victorian era's fascination with Egypt reached fever pitch. Egyptian artifacts flooded into museums. Mummy unwrappings became popular entertainment, to modernize, disturbingly disrespectful. Egyptology became an academic discipline. Scholars like E. A. Wallace Budge, though problematic by current standards, made Egyptian texts widely available through translations. Literature adopted Egyptian themes. Théophile Gautier's One of Cleopatra's Nights, Rider Haggard's She, Arthur Conan Doyle's Mummy Curse stories, Bram Stoker's The Jewel of 7 Stars. These presented Egypt as land of mystery, magic, ancient curses, and undead mummies. The mummy's curse trope, popularized by Tutankhamun's tomb discovery in 1922, became staple of horror fiction despite having little basis in actual Egyptian belief. Cinema embraced Egypt eagerly. From silent films to modern blockbusters, Egyptian mythology provides endless material. The Mummy, 1932, and multiple remakes. The Ten Commandments, 1956. Cleopatra, 1963. The Prince of Egypt, 1998. The Mummy, 1999. Gods of Egypt, 2016. These films range from serious to camp, accurate to wildly imaginative, but all demonstrate Egypt's enduring appeal as setting and subject. Modern paganism sometimes attempts to revive Egyptian religion. Kemetic orthodoxy and other neo-pagan movements worship Egyptian gods, perform adapted rituals, and claim continuity with ancient tradition. Whether this constitutes genuine revival or modern invention is debated, but it shows the living appeal of Egyptian spirituality, its perceived relevance to contemporary seekers. Academic study of Egyptian mythology reveals sophisticated theology previously underappreciated. Jan Assmann's work on Egyptian cosmology, Eric Hornung's studies of the afterlife books, John Baines's analysis of Egyptian religious thought. These scholars demonstrate that Egyptian religion was intellectually sophisticated, philosophically complex, and historically evolving rather than static and primitive. The influence appears in unexpected places. The concept of judgment after death, weighing the soul's worth, appears in Egyptian mythology centuries before similar concepts in other traditions. The idea that ethical behavior determines afterlife fate, not just ritual correctness but moral living, was revolutionary and influential. The emphasis on life after death, on preparation for eternity, shaped Western attitudes toward mortality. Egyptian art's influence on modernism was profound. The distinctive Egyptian artistic style, flat perspective, canonical proportions, hierarchical scaling, frontal and profile views combined, was revolutionary when discovered by 20th century artists seeking alternatives to Renaissance perspective. Art Deco especially absorbed Egyptian motifs after Tutankhamun's tomb discovery. The legacy is both profound and problematic. Egyptian mythology gave us concepts of judgment, afterlife, cosmic order, divine kingship, and ritualized religion that influenced later traditions. But it's also been appropriated, romanticized, misunderstood, and commodified. We've created our own mythology about Egypt, land of ancient mystery, source of lost wisdom, civilization of alien or supernatural knowledge that bears limited relation to historical reality. What survived is rich enough for continued study, yet fragmentary enough to allow imaginative reconstruction. We can learn from Egyptian wisdom, their ethical teachings, their approach to death, their sense of cosmic order, while recognizing we cannot fully recover their lived experience. The gods are silent now, the temples empty, the rituals ceased, but the legacy endures in museums, libraries, popular culture, and the ongoing human fascination with one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Modern excavation technology transformed what archaeologists could learn. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, 3D scanning, DNA analysis, isotope studies. These tools revealed information invisible to earlier excavators. We can now determine where individuals grew up by analyzing isotopes in their teeth, trace family relationships through DNA, reconstruct faces from skulls using forensic techniques, and detect hidden chambers without disturbing monuments. The mummy studies exemplify this transformation. Victorian-era mummy unwrappings destroyed evidence while entertaining audiences. Modern CT scanning reveals everything inside wrappings without damage. Broken bones, disease, age, how organs were removed, what amulets were placed where. even what the person looked like. We've learned that tuberculosis was common, that arthritis affected many Egyptians, that dental disease was epidemic, from sand in bread grinding down teeth, that life expectancy was much lower than modern standards. Genetic studies revealed surprising findings. DNA analysis of royal mummies showed that Tutankhamun's parents were siblings, probably Akhenaten and his sister, explaining some of the young king's health problems: cleft palate, club foot, possible genetic disorders. Studies of ordinary Egyptians showed population continuity over millennia, with some admixture from Nubia, the Levant, and later periods. The genetic evidence largely confirmed what artistic depictions suggested about Egyptian physical appearance. The papyri discoveries continued throughout the 20th century. The Nag Hammadi Library, found in 1945, contained Gnostic Christian texts written in Coptic, revealing the diversity of early Egyptian Christianity. Medical papyri revealed sophisticated treatments, the ebers. Papyrus contains over 800 remedies, many pharmacologically sound. Mathematical papyri showed how Egyptians calculated areas, volumes, and fractions. Literary papyri preserved stories, poetry, and wisdom literature. Translation work became increasingly sophisticated. Early translators like Budge worked quickly, often inaccurately, making Egyptian texts accessible but unreliable. Modern translation incorporates better grammatical understanding, awareness of literary conventions, sensitivity to context and connotation. We can now appreciate Egyptian literature as literature, not just documentary evidence but artistic creation with aesthetic value, emotional depth, and rhetorical sophistication. The mythological texts required particular interpretive care. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of the Dead weren't systematic theology, but collected spells, prayers, and instructions accreted over centuries. Understanding them requires recognizing internal contradictions, regional variations, historical evolution, and the difference between official theology and popular belief. A single Egyptian mythology never existed. Rather, a complex evolving tradition with local variants and temporal changes. Scholars debated fundamental questions. Were Egyptian gods actually gods, or just natural forces personified? Did Egyptians believe literally in the myths, or understand them metaphorically? How did educated priests reconcile contradictory creation accounts? Jan Assmann argued that Egyptian theology was sophisticated and self-aware, capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously, understanding that different myths expressed different aspects of divine reality. Eric Hornung's work on Egyptian conceptions of the afterlife revealed not one but multiple destinations for the dead: the field of reeds, paradise; the realm of Osiris, the Duat; circumpolar stars, imperishable ones; following Ra in the solar bark, or merging with Osiris. These weren't contradictory but complementary, different ways of conceptualizing post-mortem existence. The Egyptians, Hornung argued, were comfortable with multiplicity and fluidity in religious thought. Feminist Egyptology emerged in recent decades, examining women's roles more carefully. Queens like Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra received renewed attention, analyzed not just as anomalies, but as examples of Egyptian women's potential power. Studies of ordinary women revealed they could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, serve as priestesses, and exercise authority in ways unusual for ancient societies. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Sekhmet embodied powerful feminine divinity. The political uses of ancient Egypt by modern Egyptians became important scholarly topic. Egyptian nationalism drew on pharaonic heritage as evidence of indigenous civilization predating Arab conquest. The debate over whether ancient Egyptians were African or Mediterranean became politicized, with Afrocentrist scholars emphasizing Egypt's African identity while others stressed Mediterranean connections. DNA and isotope evidence suggests Egypt's population was always mixed, connected to both Nubia and the Levant. Museum ethics increasingly questioned the colonial-era acquisition of Egyptian artifacts. Should the Rosetta Stone return to Egypt from the British Museum? Should Nefertiti's bust leave Berlin? Egyptian authorities have pressed for repatriation, arguing that artifacts belong in their country of origin. Museums counter that they preserve artifacts for global audiences and ensure conservation. The debates continue, reflecting post-colonial reassessments of cultural property. Digital technology democratized access to Egyptian texts and monuments. High-resolution photographs, 3D models, virtual reality reconstructions. These tools let anyone explore Egyptian tombs online, study papyri in detail, and examine artifacts from multiple angles. The Oriental Institute, British Museum, Metropolitan Museum, and others digitized collections, making them freely accessible. Scholars could now compare texts across institutions without traveling. Popular understanding of Egyptian mythology improved but remained mixed. Academic documentaries like those produced by the BBC and National Geographic presented current scholarship accessibly. But pseudo-archaeology persisted, claims that pyramids were power plants, that hieroglyphics encoded advanced science, that aliens built the monuments, that Egypt possessed technology surpassing modern capability. These fantasies, though contradicted by evidence, remained popular because they offered mystery and wonder. What surprised modern scholars most was Egyptian religion's sophistication. Far from primitive superstition, it was complex theology addressing profound questions: the nature of creation, the problem of evil, the meaning of death, the basis of ethics, the relationship between divine and human, the tension between order and chaos. The answers differed from later monotheistic traditions, but the questions were universal. The ethical teachings especially resonated with modern readers. The instruction of Totep, the maxims of Ani, and similar wisdom texts taught values recognizable today: honesty, justice, kindness to the poor, respect for parents, moderation, self-control, proper speech. The negative confessions list of sins, murder, theft, lying, fraud, blasphemy, adultery, mapped closely onto later ethical codes. Ma'at as cosmic principle, truth, justice, order, balance, offered a sophisticated foundation for morality. Modern interpretation recognized Egyptian mythology as human creation, addressing human needs, explaining nature, justifying social order, providing comfort about death, offering meaning in chaos, establishing identity, transmitting values. But this recognition didn't diminish the myth's power. They remained beautiful, profound, moving precisely because they showed humans grappling with ultimate questions and creating answers of astonishing creativity and depth. The physical remains continue yielding discoveries. In 2017, archaeologists discovered a massive statue of Ramesses II in Cairo. In 2019, dozens of sealed coffins were found at Saqqara, unopened for 2,500 years. Ground-penetrating radar suggests undiscovered chambers in the Valley of the Kings. Each discovery adds detail, corrects previous understanding, raises new questions. What we still don't know remains vast. How exactly were the pyramids built? What caused the Old Kingdom's collapse? Why did Akhenaten attempt monotheistic revolution? What was the Sea People's origin? How common was literacy? What did ordinary people actually believe versus official theology? How did Egyptian religion feel to practitioners? These gaps in knowledge ensure continued research, debate, and discovery. The rediscovery of Egyptian mythology isn't complete, it's ongoing. Each excavation, each translation refinement, each technological advance reveals new aspects of this extraordinary civilization. We know more about ancient Egypt than any previous generation, yet we're constantly revising understanding as evidence accumulates. The mythology that once seemed simple fairy tales now appears as sophisticated theology worthy of serious philosophical engagement. Let's step back from mythology to chronology and detail to ask the deeper question: what does Egyptian mythology teach us about the human condition? Why did these particular stories emerge from the Nile Valley, and what universal truths might they contain beneath their culture-specific forms? The obsession with order versus chaos speaks to fundamental human experience. Every society faces entropy, the constant threat that structures will collapse, that meaning will dissolve, that civilization's fragile achievements will crumble. The Egyptians, living in a narrow ribbon of fertility surrounded by lifeless desert, felt this precariousness viscerally. The Nile's annual flood brought life, but only if it came at the right time, in the right amount, to the right places. Too little meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Ma'at versus Isfet, order versus chaos, wasn't abstract philosophy, but lived reality requiring constant maintenance. The daily temple rituals weren't superstition, but necessary work maintaining cosmic order. From this perspective, Egyptian religion makes perfect sense. It's acknowledging that order is precious, fragile, and requires collective effort to sustain. Modern societies face the same challenge, though we use different language. We maintain infrastructure, enforce laws, educate children, preserve institutions, all to keep chaos at bay. The death obsession reveals profound psychological sophistication. Other ancient cultures acknowledged death, but the Egyptians confronted it systematically, creating elaborate technologies, mummification, funerary texts, tomb construction, offering systems to address mortality's challenge. This wasn't denial, but engagement, refusing to accept death as absolute ending, insisting that something of the person could survive, persist, continue. The judgment scene in the Hall of Two Truths presents a revolutionary idea. What matters for the afterlife isn't birth, status, or wealth, but ethical behavior. Your heart is weighed against Mayat's feather, your actions, choices, how you lived. This democratization of the afterlife, initially only pharaohs achieved resurrection, anticipated later religious developments. Every person faced the same judgment, required the same ethical living, could achieve the same destination. Birth as pharaoh or farmer didn't determine eternal fate. The myth of Osiris addresses grief, loss, restoration, and hope with remarkable emotional intelligence. Isis's search for Osiris's body, her gathering of the scattered pieces, her performance of the first mummification, this is grief work made mythological. She doesn't simply mourn, she acts, uses magic, refuses to accept loss as final. The myth validates grief while offering hope that love can transcend death, that the dead aren't entirely gone, that restoration is possible even after violent destruction. The Contendings of Horus and Set explores power, legitimacy, and conflict resolution. Should legitimate succession, Horus as rightful heir, or practical capability, Set as powerful god, determine rulership? The 80-year struggle before the gods reach judgment shows political sophistication. Authority requires multiple forms of legitimacy, not just birthright or force. The resolution doesn't destroy Set, but assigns him proper role, recognizing that even dangerous, chaotic forces serve necessary functions. The creation myths address existence's fundamental mystery. Why is there something rather than nothing? Atum creating himself from none, the self-generating God bringing cosmos from chaos through acts of will and speech, grapples with the same question modern physicists ask about universe origins. The Egyptian answer, that consciousness, desire, and creative will precede physical reality, differs from materialist explanations but addresses the same mystery. The concept of multiple souls, Ka, Ba, Akh, name, shadow, suggests psychological sophistication. Humans aren't unified selves, but complex combinations of life force, personality, spiritual essence, social identity, and mysterious shadow self. Modern psychology recognizes similar complexity. We contain multitudes, contradictions, different aspects that emerge in different contexts. The Egyptian soul division articulates this multiplicity in mythological language. The animal-headed gods aren't primitive confusion, but symbolic sophistication. Anubis's jackal head references how jackals scavenge cemeteries, making them associated with death and transformation. Thoth's ibis head connects to the ibis's careful, measured walk, appropriate for the god of wisdom and precision. Sekhmet's lioness head invokes feline power and danger. The forms communicate divine attributes through visual metaphor, making abstract concepts concrete and memorable. The cyclical time conception, daily solar rebirth, annual Nile flood, eternal cosmic patterns, differs from linear time but captures important truths. Nature operates cyclically. Seasons return. Generations repeat patterns. History rhymes if not repeats. The Egyptian emphasis on eternal return, on maintaining order through ritual repetition, acknowledges that some aspects of existence are fundamentally cyclical rather than progressive. Yet Egyptian thought also recognized change, development, historical progression. The myths themselves evolved over 3 millennia. New gods emerged, old ones faded. Theological syntheses combined deities, beliefs adapted to changing circumstances. The tension between eternal patterns and historical change, between what endures and what transforms, runs through Egyptian religion. The pharaoh as god-king addresses political authority's legitimation. Why should anyone obey rulers? The Egyptian answer, because the ruler is divine, maintaining cosmic order, serving as intermediary between human and divine realms, justified centralized authority while also imposing responsibilities. The pharaoh had to maintain ma'at, had to rule justly, had to perform rituals correctly. Divine kingship wasn't arbitrary power, but sacred duty with cosmic consequences. Modern democratic societies reject divine kingship, but we still grapple with legitimating authority. We use different justifications: popular sovereignty, constitutional law, separation of powers, but address the same fundamental question. What makes power legitimate? What responsibilities accompany authority? How do we prevent rulers from becoming tyrants? Egyptian mythology's answers differ from ours, but engage the same concerns. The emphasis on names and naming reveals profound insight about language and identity. To know something's true name is to have power over it. To be named is to exist. To have your name preserved is to continue after death. This isn't primitive magic, but recognition that language constructs reality, that naming shapes understanding, that social memory depends on recorded names. Modern philosophy of language acknowledges similar insights about how language mediates between consciousness and world. The multiplicity of gods, sometimes contradictory, sometimes merged, always fluid, suggests sophisticated theological thinking. Perhaps the Egyptians understood that ultimate reality exceeds any single description, that different metaphors capture different aspects, that holding multiple perspectives simultaneously reveals more than insisting on one truth. This anticipates both modern physics' complementarity, light as both wave and particle, and postmodern recognition of perspectival truth. The mythology's emotional range, joy and grief, love and rage, hope and despair, confidence and doubt, validates the full spectrum of human feeling. The gods experience emotions, make mistakes, learn, grow. They're not distant perfections, but intensely relatable presences who nevertheless remain divine. This makes emotional experience sacred rather than merely human, suggesting that feeling deeply connects us to cosmic reality. Perhaps most profoundly, Egyptian mythology insists that death is transformation rather than ending. Every sunset promises sunrise. Every inundation brings renewal. Osiris dies but rules the afterlife. The deceased journey through trials but can reach paradise. Even the daily struggle against chaos, though eternal, is winnable moment by moment. This isn't naive optimism, but hard-won hope, acknowledging darkness while refusing to surrender to it. The sun is setting now, just as it has set over Egypt for millions of evenings, casting golden light across the Nile, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't simply atmospheric phenomenon, but divine drama. Ra dying, descending into the Duat, beginning his perilous journey through 12 hours of darkness, battling Apophis, the serpent of chaos, trusting that dawn would come, that resurrection was possible, that order would prevail once more. We've travelled together through the entire arc of Egyptian mythology, from the moment before creation, when only Nun's formless waters existed, through the gods' births and struggles, the establishment of cosmic order, the golden age of divine rule, the challenges and transformations, the gradual fading of belief, the centuries of silence, and finally, the modern rediscovery that lets these ancient voices speak again. What strikes me most, sitting with these stories as evening deepens, is their fundamental humanity. Yes, they feature animal-headed deities and cosmic battles and magical resurrections, but beneath the exotic surface they address the same questions that keep you and me awake at night. Where did we come from? Why are we here? How should we live? What happens when we die? Why is there suffering? How do we create meaning in a universe that seems indifferent? How do we face our own mortality? The Egyptian answers, wrapped in mythology about sun gods and mummification and judgment halls, were their way of wrestling with these eternal questions. Our answers differ. We use different language, different frameworks, different metaphors. But we're asking the same questions, feeling the same uncertainties, hoping for the same reassurances that our lives matter, that love transcends death, that order can triumph over chaos, that we might somehow continue beyond the grave. The tragedy and the beauty of Egyptian mythology is that it ended. The temples closed. The priests died. The hieroglyphics became unreadable. The unbroken chain connecting each generation to its divine origins finally broke after 3,000 years. An entire elaborate system for understanding the universe, for relating to the divine, for preparing for eternity, just stopped, replaced by different beliefs, different gods, different answers. But nothing is truly lost. The pyramids still stand, monuments to ambition and faith, and the human drive to create something eternal. The tombs still hold their painted secrets, vivid testimony to how these people loved life so much they couldn't bear for it to end. The papyri still whisper their spells and stories. The statues still gaze with enigmatic smiles, guarding mysteries we've only partially recovered. We can read their words now, after 14 centuries of silence. We can walk through their temples, decipher their myths, analyze their beliefs. We know more about ancient Egypt than any medieval scholar dreamed possible. Yet we can never fully recover what it felt like to be Egyptian, to see the Nile's flood as divine blessing, to truly believe that Osiris would judge your heart, to prepare your entire life for an afterlife you genuinely expected. That lived experience is gone, irrecoverable, lost with the last believers who took their faith seriously rather than studying it academically. We're archaeologists of belief, collectors of fragments, translators of a dead religion. We can admire, analyze, appreciate, but we can't resurrect the lived reality of Egyptian faith any more than future archaeologists, excavating our ruins millennia hence, could resurrect what it feels like to be you, reading this right now. Yet Egyptian mythology endures precisely because it's beautiful, profound and true, not literally, factually true, but emotionally, psychologically, symbolically true. The myths articulate permanent aspects of human experience, our confrontation with death, our hope for meaning, our struggle between order and chaos, our capacity for love that refuses to accept loss as final, our drive to create something lasting in the face of inevitable decay. Isis searching for Osiris's scattered body isn't historical fact, but it's profound truth about grief, determination, and love's refusal to surrender. The daily battle between Ra and Apophis isn't astronomy, but it's deep wisdom about how order requires constant vigilance, how every day renews the struggle, how we must keep fighting chaos even when victory is never final. The judgment of the heart isn't literal courtroom, but it's powerful ethics, the insistence that our actions matter, that justice exists, that we're accountable for how we live. What I hope you take from this journey isn't just information, dates, names, facts, though there's value in understanding this remarkable civilization. What I hope you feel is connection across vast gulfs of time and culture to people who face the same mysteries, asked the same questions, and created answers of stunning beauty and depth. They built in stone because they wanted to last forever. They wrote on tomb walls because they believed words had power. They mummified their dead because they refused to accept death as ending. They created gods because they needed the universe to have meaning, purpose, divine presence. In all this, they were intensely, achingly human, just like us, just like everyone who's ever looked at the stars and wondered, or faced loss and grieved, or hoped that somehow something of us continues. The ancient Egyptians are dead now, truly dead, beyond even their own hope of resurrection. The gods they worshipped no longer answer prayers. The spells they wrote no longer guide souls through the afterlife. The elaborate system they constructed with such care and faith has collapsed into historical curiosity. But their voice remains. In museums, in papyri, on temple walls, in tomb paintings, their words still speak. And perhaps that's its own form of resurrection, not the literal bodily continuation they hoped for, but something. Memory, legacy, the persistence of ideas across millennia. The way their stories still move us, teach us, connect us to our shared humanity. So as you go about your evening, wherever you are in the world, whatever you believe, however you make sense of existence's mysteries, remember that 3,000 years ago, people stood where you stand now, facing similar questions, constructing similar hopes, believing passionately in answers we can barely comprehend. They loved, suffered, created, hoped, and died. Their civilization ended. Their gods fell silent. Their beliefs faded. But something survived. These stories survived, and maybe that's enough. Not resurrection, but remembrance. Not eternal life, but the knowledge that we were here, that we built, that we believed, that we tried to make meaning in a mysterious universe. The Egyptians achieved their goal, perhaps differently than they imagined. They are remembered. They live in our continued fascination with their achievements, our study of their beliefs, our wonder at their monuments. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Egyptian mythology. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What surprised you? What aspects of Egyptian belief speak to your own experience of life, death, meaning, and mystery? Drop a comment and share your reflections. Until next time, may you find your own ma'at, your own balance between order and chaos, your own answers to the eternal questions that unite us all across the centuries. The sun has set, the journey through darkness begins, but dawn will come. It always does.